Today, we're going to talk about Alice Walker's everyday use. We'll do that for 2 days, and today is the first day that we'll discuss it. Alice Walker's story is a well anthologized story. It's in many anthologies, and it's a well read story, largely because it's a very, very well organized story and a very sophisticated, structured story. She uses a number of important techniques, particularly the ways in which she presents the internal thoughts of certainly one of the main characters in the story, which is this mother figure, and also because of the themes and the topics that she uses, which we're going to examine in some detail. Um, Alice Walker's a little bit about Alice Walker. Alice Walker is probably is among the great American novelists and writers. She's published quite a number of books of fiction. Her early work was in poetry, actually. One of her first collections, the first works of publication, was a collection of poems. And that collection of poems were many of the poems were written while she was um, I think she was either in the Peace Corps or she was doing research in East Africa in the late 60s, early 70s, and many of the poems reflect her thinking along those lines. Her novels, of course, have been rooted in the world in which she came from. She's a woman born and raised in the South, and she had a very challenging time in the South, both on one hand a time of understanding herself to be amongst a black community, the protectiveness of the black community. But also in other circumstances, she witnessed many difficult issues and difficult situations. In fact, one of the interesting things we learn about Alice Walker, especially in the introduction, is the injury she suffered in her eye as a child. She was shot accidentally, or some would say it wasn't accidentally. And in many ways, this led her to a period of real introspection and actually silencing. She took herself away from the world and felt as if she was a different person. She had this eye that has been damaged, and the eye was never healed. So Alice Walker always lived with this particular handicap, and she developed many of her ideas about her body, her relationship to her culture and her world, out of this period of challenge and difficulty. Most of you, of course, would know of Alice Walker primarily because of her novel published in the very, very early 80s called The Color Purple. And The Color Purple is a short, beautiful novel. It's what we call an epistolary novel because it's a novel that takes the form of these letters, and they are largely letters to God. And they are letters written by a woman who growing up in a southern environment, after just as a period after slavery, but this is a period where African Americans are still trying to make their way in the world. And it's a fascinating tale about a woman's coming of age, coming into an understanding of herself and her identity. The Color Purple was made into a very, very famous and successful film directed by Steven Spielberg. It was controversial at the time. On one hand, because of course Spielberg at this time was known primarily for his action movies and that kind of film work. It represented one of his first forays into what we'd call solid high drama, but it was actually very well received in terms of its nominations. It received a ton of nominations, but badly received because it won no awards. Amongst the people who starred in that film were Whoopi Goldberg, Oprah Winfrey, um, and just an array of brilliant actors who many of them gained fame because of the work that they did in that film. The film was also controversial because in the novel itself, it's a strong novel that sort of enters into the space of looking at a lesbian relationship and celebrating this lesbian relationship and this liberation that a woman has to be able to have this lesbian relationship. The film downplays that significantly, and this was, of course, the source of some controversy. But at the same time, the film was branded as a film that seemed to put down black men and seemed to attack black men and so on. And I think this was one of the problems. It's interesting because the film came out just about 1985, 86, just at the same time when Spike Lee released his film, She's Gotta Have It. And it's a very interesting period where we are looking at massive debates on television and so on and so forth about the ways in which the black body and the black men are treated. You remember I mentioned Alice Walker at some point when we were talking about Zora Neale Hurston. That's another thing that she was quite famous for. For Alice Walker was the person who identified Zora Neale Hurston's work and really was responsible for bringing it back into, or bringing it into the American canon in a very powerful and meaningful way that to this day we cannot talk about the American novel without thinking about Zora Neale Hurston and accounting for Zora Neale Hurston's, especially Her Eyes Were Watching God. This is largely, one can fairly say, because of the work of Alice Walker. And it's interesting because Alice Walker was accused of the very same thing that Zora Neale Hurston was accused of, which was that Alice Walker wanted to write about African American experience, but particularly the experience of African American women. And in her work, looking at African American women, as in The Color Purple, she had to deal with the abuse of African American women by African American men. And in her dealing with this, she was accused of, as was Zora Neale Hurston, of among the black community of washing our dirty laundry in public. And Alice Walker, of course, argued that if we did not deal with the oppressions that were within our own culture, then we have no right to be complaining or to be speaking with any kind of righteous authority about the oppressions from outside. It's a very complicated question. And some of these themes and ideas will creep into and certainly be central to looking at everyday use and how it's dealt with and how she deals with it in that work.